I'm going to start with the observation that human dignity is the foundational concept of the global human rights regime. We look at the body of international human rights law. This is repeated over and over again. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, quote, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. The 1966 International Human Rights Covenants say pretty much the same thing. Quote, these rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. And the 1993 Vienna Declaration of the World Human Rights Conference likewise affirms, quote, all human rights derive from the dignity and worth inherent in the human person. So when we think about the body of international human rights law, which really defines what human rights mean in contemporary international relations, the foundational linkage between human dignity and human rights is very clear. It's also, however, rather obscure, because there's no definition of human dignity, and there's no account offered in this body of international law. These are, after all, lawyers rather than philosophers, of exactly how it is that human dignity is supposed to ground human rights. All right, that's the topic that I want to address. Just how is it that human dignity grounds human rights? Right. I'm a theorist who's big on concepts, so I had a whole section on definitions, given what I just did. I'll cut most of that and narrow it down a bit, and simply suggest that the overarching idea behind dignity is the idea of worth that demands respect. To talk about dignity is to say that the holder of dignity has a certain kind of worth, and that worth demands a particular kind of respect. In other words, there's both an internal dimension, a worth, and an external dimension, a respect, a status, a rank, a way of being treated that is essential to what we mean by dignity. So that different conceptions or theories of dignity give a particular substance to this general idea of worth that demands respect by, for example, specifying what counts as that worth, or how it is that respect is supposed to be given. More particularly, I want to suggest that a substantive account of dignity must at minimum specify three things. What types of entities have dignity, that is, the subjects of dignity. What gives rise to the worth that demands respect, or the source of dignity, and the appropriate forms of respect due to that worth. All right? Now, we're not talking about dignity in general here, we're talking about human dignity. And by human dignity, we mean the dignity, the worth that demands respect, that arises simply from being human. Much as human rights are rights that arise simply because one is human. Non-humans have dignity, and humans may have dignity that is not rooted in their humanity. But human dignity, as we understand it, which is our topic here today, is about the worth that humans have as humans and the respect due to that worth. In contemporary understandings, the respect due to humans as a result of their dignity is largely specified in terms of human rights. In previous eras, other forms of respect, such as high status or rank, were seen as appropriate recognition of dignity. In fact, in French in the 17th and 18th century, dignity was a term that was used to express titles of nobility. Right? And in fact, dignity originated as an attribute of an aristocratic elite. If we go back to classical Latin, right, dignitas, the root of the term both in English and in French and in some other languages as well, is actually an attribute of those of high social status. Right? Today, however, we have a conception of dignity that is rooted on human dignity, which suggests that all beings have a particular worth, And the respect that that worth is due is formulated in terms of human rights. That is, equal and inalienable universal rights that all humans have simply because they're human. All right, which now then brings us really to my topic. How is it that being human and having a dignity as a human gives ground to human rights? Right? If we look at the scholarly literature, there are essentially three approaches to the relationship between human dignity and human rights. The first is largely dismissive. It argues that human dignity is a hopelessly vague notion that at best appears to provide some kind of deeper foundation for human rights, but that in fact doesn't. Let me give you three passages that express this image. Quote, "The concept of dignity is itself vacuous. As a legal or philosophical concept, it is without bounds. The term is so elusive as to be virtually meaningless." Quote, "The concept of human dignity does not give us enough guidance. It has different senses and often points us in opposite directions." Or, I think this is my favorite, "Dignity is a fuzzy concept, and appeals to dignity are often used to substitute for empirical evidence that is lacking or sound arguments that cannot be mustered." All right? And I think, in fact, there's a certain kind of truth to this. Lots of appeals to dignity actually are pretty empty. They don't actually add anything to the account. They simply suggest that somehow there must be some kind of foundation for human rights, and human dignity is a language that we use. But I think that this is an accidental feature of many discussions, not something that's inherent. There are two approaches that I think are worth taking seriously that give real substance to this claim of linkage. First, human dignity is often presented as rooted in some particular characteristic of humans. For example, Alan Gaworth defines human dignity as, quote, "a kind of intrinsic worth that belongs to all human beings as such, constituted by certain intrinsically valuable aspects of being human." All right, following Kant, autonomy and reason are frequently mentioned as the characteristics of humans that are worth taking seriously. Hoda referred to George Kaitab's notion that humanity is capable of breaking with nature, all right, a notion that goes back to at least Pico della Mirandola, and the idea that our capacity for self-transformation is what makes us human. In contemporary Christian accounts, the notion that human beings are created by and in the image of God is often appealed to as the substantive foundation of human dignity. Right? So that one set of appeals is this idea that there is something particular about humans, all right, that defines their dignity. Right? The other, I call this an essential attributes approach to human dignity. The other approach is to see human dignity as some kind of foundational, declaratory, and undefined sort of notion. Right? As one theorist puts it, quote, "a sort of axiom in the system, or a familiar and accepted principle of shared morality. A bedrock concept that resists definition in terms of something else." Now, these sorts of accounts take many forms. For example, Klaus Dicke presents human dignity as it appears in international human rights law as, quote, "a formal transcendental norm, or a formal background value." Joel Feinberg, a leading legal philosopher, suggests that attributing human dignity involves, quote, "expressing an attitude, the attitude of respect toward the humanity in each man's person." William Parent, another philosopher, argues for understanding human dignity as essentially ascriptive. As he puts it, sentences of the form, "I have dignity," and "she has dignity," when used to make moral claims, serve to ascribe the fundamental moral right not to be unjustly debased. It's an account very similar to the Rosen account that Hoda was talking about before. All right. Now, what I want to suggest is that neither of these two approaches is exactly right, but that combining them in a particular way gives us a plausible and attractive account of how human dignity grounds human rights. Human dignity, I will argue, is not an unanalyzable principle. It can be analyzed in terms of deeper notions. Neither, however, though, is it reducible to one, a few, or a particular set of attributes. I want to suggest that human dignity is an intermediate concept that helps to link human rights to deeper foundational moral and political views. And here I'm going to use a notion that was first developed by John Rawls, the idea of an overlapping consensus. All right, this should be familiar to some of you in the room, but to others it's not, so let me sort of cash out the idea here. Rawls makes a distinction between what he calls comprehensive doctrines, which are foundational moral or religious systems of thought or worldview. So on the one hand, we've got these comprehensive doctrines, right? Things like Christianity, Islam, Kantianism, utilitarianism, Marxism. And on the other hand, we have what Rawls calls political conceptions of justice, which I think for Americans we can think of as essentially constitutional principles of political legitimacy that are defined largely independent of any particular comprehensive doctrine. Now, Rawls developed this idea in trying to understand how liberal societies can in fact agree on constitutional principles despite the immense diversity of substantive religious, philosophical, and political views that are included within these societies. And essentially, Rawls argues that in liberal societies, there is an overarching political conception of justice, in American terms, the Constitution, and that there is an overlapping consensus among a great range of comprehensive doctrines on these views. So that Christians and atheists, liberals and conservatives, Marxists, Kantians, utilitarians, whatever comprehensive doctrine you appeal to, provides a certain kind of foundation for this political conception of justice, a set of constitutional principles of legitimacy. I think this is actually a very, very good description of contemporary liberal democratic societies. Right? For example, I think that George Bush and I probably are happy to say that we agree on almost nothing at the level of foundational doctrines. And yet, we agree pretty much on fundamental constitutional principles. We might not agree on whether pretending to drown somebody is torture, all right, but we certainly agree on fundamental constitutional principles. There is an overarching political conception of justice that people with widely divergent substantive moral and religious views hold. Now, what I have argued elsewhere is that we can think of international human rights in exactly these terms. Human rights are not foundational moral principles. Right? They're a political conception of justice. Right? So, for example, if you look at the history of Western moral thought, right, nobody appeals to rights as foundational. For example, Kant in Theory and Practice, the most accessible version of his moral, political, and international theory. He works out his moral theory entirely without reference to rights. And yet, when he starts on his political theory, the first sentence appeals to rights. Right? Rights in general, and human rights in particular, are legal and political concepts And the body of international human rights law can be seen as a political conception of justice that is justified by incredibly diverse fundamental doctrines. All right, so that there is substantial work on Islamic conceptions of human rights, because it is a fairly simple matter to trace a path back from human rights to fundamental Islamic conceptions, or the other direction, to ask, as a Muslim, what is it that my foundational beliefs suggest about the proper way to organize society and to organize the relations between individuals and societies? And we can do this for group after group after group after group. All right. Now, what I want to suggest here is that human dignity is also not a foundational concept, but an intermediate notion, a political conception of justice. That, in fact, there is no single conception of human dignity that grounds human rights, but rather there are a wide variety of conceptions of human dignity, and that human dignity is a placeholder. It's a point of convergence between different substantive conceptions, so that Christians have a different conception of human dignity than atheists, all right, who don't believe that there is a God to create man in his image. All right, and yet they both, in the contemporary world, have bought into this idea that there is some notion of a universal dignity, and that their own deepest philosophical and religious beliefs allow them to provide a foundational justification for this very thinly specified idea. All right? In other words, human dignity is not truly foundational, but rather something on which there is an overlapping consensus. That different comprehensive doctrines provide different substantive accounts of human dignity, but these accounts are sufficiently convergent that they end up supporting each other and provide a shared but diverse foundation for human rights. And those who actually don't want to go any deeper than the political conception of justice represented by the body of international human rights law can simply accept it as an axiom. But those who want deeper foundations can, by working through the overarching thin idea of human dignity, root it in their own deeply held views about the nature of man, the nature of society, the nature of the cosmos. All right? In other words, I agree with David Weistraub that, quote, although ambiguous, dignity is a signaling term that goes to the heart of what constitutes the quality of humanness. But that ambiguity, I want to suggest to you, arises neither from any special lack of clarity, nor from the absence of deeper substantive foundations. Rather, it arises from the fact that for different people, human dignity points to different, deeper foundations, which provide personal or moral meaning and remove much of the ambiguity of the meaning of the concept. This, I believe, helps to explain the fact that, as Glenn Tinder puts it, quote, the dignity of the individual is a cliche, and yet it retains surprising force. All right? And I think that that captures both dimensions of it. There is a certain kind of almost empty cliche notion to human dignity in the abstract, and yet it retains considerable force because it is a route to tapping into a wide variety of deeply held views. In other words, the summary or signaling term human dignity is indeed something of a stale cliche, or a seemingly empty or hopelessly vague concept, or a merely formal principle. But lurking beneath this apparent lack of content is a range of foundational meanings that, despite their differences in detail, converge enough to provide a bridge between the body of international human rights law and most of the leading comprehensive doctrines in the contemporary world. All right? In other words, it's not simply a cliche, because the deeper foundations that are provided by an overlapping consensus. All right? Now, you can get to the same point by drawing a distinction between thick and thin conceptions of dignity. But I want to suggest that the idea of overlapping consensus is preferable because it emphasizes the simultaneous presence of multiple converging thick accounts. Human dignity as it appears in international human rights law is thin, but there are multiple converging thick accounts of dignity that give real depth and substance to this idea. Dignity is thinly specified in international human rights law, I would suggest, actually in order to allow multiple overlapping thick accounts to endorse human rights. A thin legal specification, in other words, is an opening to multicultural diversity. Right? And I think that that's important, that there is not a single shared conception of human dignity in the contemporary world. There are overlapping conceptions. In other words, human dignity is only quasi-foundational. The real foundations are a series of overlapping substantive accounts of dignity. There is no single foundation for human rights, but rather multiple foundations. And I want to suggest that this is actually one of the great attractions of the body of international human rights law, because there is no single account on which people can agree, and yet the diverse foundations that are provided by different philosophical perspectives are sufficiently convergent that it's not merely empty to talk about a universal human dignity and a universal human rights. A different way of putting it is, rather than a single taproot, there's a complex web of roots. And as we all know, a complex interlocking web is actually much stronger than a single root. And that one of the great virtues of international human rights law as it's been developed is precisely this openness. Going back to the late 1940s, Jacques Maritain famously said, "We all agree about human rights so long as you don't ask us why." All right, and I think that this is a fundamentally important insight. We don't have to agree on why we agree to organize our societies and politics around human rights. What is important is that we agree, and that we agree for more than merely instrumental reasons. That we agree for deep philosophical reasons, not necessarily for the same deep philosophical reason. Right? How much time do I have left? How long have I gone? How long have I gone?
You've got about 5 minutes.
Good. Okay, that's about what I want to do. All right. Now, in other words, some broadly defined but not empty conceptions of human dignity underlie and thus help to shape contemporary conceptions of human rights. But I want to suggest to you also that the body of established international human rights law also shapes our understandings of human dignity. That there is actually a two-way relationship between human rights and human dignity in the contemporary world. The concept of human dignity originally emerged largely separate from the idea of human rights. For example, Kant discusses the notion of dignity most frequently in the concept of duties to oneself, not in any social context at all. Today, however, human rights and human dignity have increasingly become fused, not confused. All right? One can think of human dignity independently of human rights. It's philosophically possible, it's historically common. However, today this is increasingly becoming uncommon. The growing prominence of human rights makes the link between human rights and human dignity increasingly appear to be normative rather than accidental. In other words, in the contemporary world, human rights and human dignity are mutually co-constitutive. Human rights reflect a particular specification of certain minimum preconditions for a life of dignity, but our detailed understanding of human dignity has been shaped by our ideas and practices of human rights. And the practice of human rights can be seen as justified in some ultimate sense by its production of beings that are able to live a life of dignity. In other words, human rights go beyond the inherent dignity of the human person to provide mechanisms for realizing a life of dignity in the social and political world. Human rights both specify forms of life that are worthy of beings with an inherent moral worth, but they also provide legal and political practices to realize a life of dignity that in fact vindicates the inherent worth of the human person. In other words, human rights insist that the inherent worth of human beings must not be left in an abstract philosophical or religious domain, but rather must be expressed in everyday life through practices that respect and realize human rights, and thus human dignity. This is the challenge that we face today, in other words, to use human rights to construct the foundations for realized lives of dignity for all humans across this planet. Thanks very much.